introduce first our head of department, Professor Barak Kushnel, who is a historian of East Asia. He's going to deliver his greeting and launch our series. So please, Professor Kushnel.
Thank you very much, Noga. I'm glad to see that we overcame an electrical problem in the US and a few other glitches across the world, and everything has been seamlessly organized at the very end. Welcome everyone from various parts of the globe to the inaugural lecture for the Injun Distinguished Lecture Series. I'm Barak Kushner, and I'm head of the department, but I'm also co-chair of the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies here at Cambridge University. It gives me great pleasure to extend our deep appreciation to the Tzu Chi Foundation in Taiwan for their generous support of this series. It's an honor to be the site for the first lecture in this series, and we are grateful for all the support the foundation has provided, not only to us for this lecture, but to the entire network across the world, including universities in the US, Canada, the UK, and China. Without further ado, let us move to the proceedings and the introduction of the speaker. I will turn over, actually I was gonna say I'll turn over the baton or the floor, but it's actually I'll turn over my screen to my colleague, Dr. Noga Ghanani, who is our university lecturer in the study of late imperial China, who will take on that task. Thank you very much again from here at Cambridge University in United Kingdom.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Kushner. I would also like to express our very profound thanks to the Tzu Chi Foundation for its generous support and also for its very kind help in organizing this event. We're very excited to welcome today Professor Eugene Wang from Harvard University. Eugene Wang is the Abby Aldrich Rockefeller Professor of Asian Arts at Harvard, as well as a Guggenheim Fellow and a winner of the 2006 Nishijin Sakamoto Academic Achievement Award. He's also the founding director of Harvard CamLab and the art history editor of the Encyclopedia of Buddhism. Professor Wang's research has been a leading force in the fields, not only of Chinese studies and Buddhism, but also Chinese art and cinema for many years now. The scope of his work is truly extraordinary, and his publications are far too numerous for us to list here. But may I just briefly mention that his current work focuses on the cognitive art history of luminance and topography of vision, which sounds absolutely fascinating. The title of Professor Wang's talk today is Buddhist Art for the 21st Century. What might it look like? So please join me in welcoming Professor Wang, and thank you very much for joining us today.
All right. Thank you. I want to thank the Tzu Chi Foundation for sponsoring this event. And I want to thank Professor Kushner and Professor Noga Ghani and other colleagues at the University of Cambridge for hosting this talk. I had very fond memories of staying at Darwin College and loitering on the University of Cambridge. I have since been obsessed with one question. You have River Camp there, we have Charles River here. Why haven't we developed the fine craft of punting here in Cambridge, Mass? Speaking of punting, I'm going to put, here's one. I'm going to punt at least partially what I'm supposed to do or to deliver. I could see the challenge facing my task that prevents me from fully delivering on the subject that I intend to speak today. Let me share my screen. Okay. Can you see the screen now?
Yes, we can, yes.
Okay. So the challenge is this: the formulation, Buddhist art for the 21st century, is actually a very fraught proposition. What is Buddhism in the first place? The diversity of schools and the tradition of Buddhism across Asia makes it hard to settle for a stable reference point. There is also a question of whether Buddhism is to be reduced to doctrines or institutions or individual practices. Even meditation commonly associated with Buddhism, has recent revisionists argue, is not necessarily Buddhist primary preoccupation. To apply this fraud term to art makes it even more challenging. As an institutional practice, art itself has undergone drastic makeovers in the past century or so, to the extent that it has remained a vexing matter of contention. So we have two cans of worms already. On top of that, it sounds really presumptuous to propose Buddhist art for the 21st century. There's a perception, not entirely groundless, that Buddhism, unlike Christianity, has not handled the transition to modernity well. It had abruptly been catapulted into modernity. Until the mid-20th century, it had largely held onto the pre-modern or medieval mode of existence. In the meantime, there is also the perception that in some ways Buddhism, or more precisely early Buddhism, is closer to our 21st century sensibility. Why? Because it is so argued that early Buddhism has no use for absolutism, nor does it harden into religion. It acknowledges impermanence and accepts contingency as its mode of being. The 21st century therefore finds early Buddhism its kindred spirit. What about Buddhist art? Can we also go back to early Buddhist art to look for our kindred spirit? Partly, there were competing modes of representing Buddhahood in early Buddhist art. Is it better to show his footprints, hence the presence of his absence? Or, or simply display, can we show his footprints or show his likeness so as to put the beholder in his presence? Different regions and traditions have their own preferences. Overall, the iconic tradition has overrun Asia and even the world and overwhelmed our perception. We have grown to associate Buddhist art primarily with the figural art, with the human body as the primary medium and object of depiction. Along the way, there were pushbacks. Notable among them was the iconoclastic Chan or Zen painting by the freakish painter Liang Kai, showing the sixth patriarch tearing up Buddhist sutras, attending to the daily routine of bamboo chopping. Even if we run through the notable experimental artworks with Buddhist overtones in the past century or so, we see a pattern of moving away from Buddhist statues. So here's my idiosyncratic rundown of the notable milestones in the history of the long 20th century. So you can see that the larger pattern is a drift or move away from the iconic tradition. So to be iconic or not to be, that used to be the question. Increasingly, it ceased to be a question since a good part of the 20th century. Let's zero in on very interesting historical moment. That is when the problem of whether to be iconic or not to be iconic was still a problem. The problem came to a head in China in 1928. Two different kinds of Buddhist images were created. They both kind of stretched the boundary and pushed the boundary a bit. The first was to honor Li Shutong, aka Master Hong Yi. Li was a 20th century Renaissance man excelling in music, painting, calligraphy, and theater. 7 years after he returned from Japan, where he received his education, he became Buddhist monastic in 1918. 10 years later, Feng Zikai, Hong Yi's student, began to produce serious drawings to illustrate his mentor's Buddhist poems. The serial publication, titled Protection of Sentient Being, a picture album, took half a century to finish. The letter, the leaf here, featuring Hong Yi's poem and Feng's drawing, comes from the first volume, published in February 1929. It features the present bliss of fish and ducks roaming in water and their doomed future destination on the chopping board. The poem ends with the line, "Tears stream down in spite of myself." Around the same time, another kind of Buddhist image appeared in the press. The Beiyang Pictorial News, Beiyang Huabao, ran a full page under the heading Oriental Beauties. Included are 5 images, 2 of them are Buddhist subjects. One is a painting of Bodhisattva Guanyin Avalokiteshvara by Xu Beihong, a celebrated painter of the time. The other is a seated female nude titled Iconic Splendor. The photograph was taken in China by Hans von Pirkheimer, an Austrian-Hungarian. Pirkheimer joined World War I and was taken prisoner by the Japanese in Qingdao from 1917 to 1919. He stayed in China after release from prison. He put his soft, focused photographic craft to creative use. His choreography involved deliberately posed Chinese female nudes. To overcome the challenge of lack of models, the photographer found his models in Macau brothels. The publication of his photos in Berlin in 1928 was a success. This is hardly surprising. It fulfilled the Orientalist fantasy. The quote-unquote Buddhist icon fits the bill. What is surprising is its appearance in the Beiyang Pictorial News in the same year, along with the Guanyin painting by Xu Beihong. It was only 3 years earlier that the Jiangsu provincial government proposed a ban on the use of female nudes for live drawing on grounds of its indecency and the shaming effect on young women. It caused a heated debate in the press. Pirkheimer's photograph of the iconic splendor remains cognitively and conceptually challenging. It is such an outlier that we still don't quite know what to make of it. If pressed, one can see it as part of the push to liberate women from the feudal shackles and to go with the new bodybuilding movement in China at the time. One may also cite an episode from the Lotus Sutra, that is the Dragon Daughter's attainment of Buddhahood, to justify the shocking arrangement of a female nude posing in a manner of a Buddha. One can even fast forward to 1967. Yoko Ono staged Cut Piece, a provocative conceptual art and performance on a Buddhist theme. Ono invited audience members to come to the stage. Each was instructed to cut one piece of fabric from her best suit until she could barely hold on to the tatters covering her body. The underlying script draws on Mahasattva Jataka about the young prince's compassionate self-sacrifice. He throws his body to a dying hungry tigress so that the tigress could be nourished and feed her baby cubs. The power of the performance transcends the Buddhist source. To watch Ono tearing up, at least in the video I saw, is viscerally painful and unsettling. It is perhaps this engineered spectral unease and growing self-awareness that the piece was aiming for. But then Ono said in an interview that she actually felt herself in a trance, that it was the 1960s after all. Both Ono's cut piece and Purkhammer's photograph can be seen in the framework of Buddhist art. However, much as Ono's cut piece worked for audience in 1960s Tokyo, much as Ono's cut piece worked for audience in 1960s Tokyo and New York, can it justifiably align with Heinz von Purkhammer's iconic splendor in 1928 China? Moreover, can the latter be aligned with Feng Zikai's protection of sentient beings? Both appear in China around the same time. Both were tied to Buddhism. One mimes Buddhist iconography and female nudity for orientalized aesthetic flavor. The other sought to arouse Buddhist compassion. It is notable that prior to his Buddhist ordination, Master Hongyi, whose poem is featured here, may have been the first to introduce live drawing to China. By 1928, it would hardly be conceivable for Master Hongyi to countenance Purkhammer's nude photography in the guise of Buddhist iconography. But we would never know. Comparing the two shows the complexity of Buddhist art around 1928 in China. It accentuates the specificity of context and the period circumstances. Without context as such, there will be no such thing as Buddhist art. The evolution of Buddhist art has always been a matter of contingency, that is, dependent origination. A seed grows and adapts to new circumstances. To predict the trajectory of Buddhist art of the 21st century, we can only start with the previous century or so. Where should we start then? I'll pick 1884 for reasons that shall be clear in a minute. Before we hit that sweet spot, let me, by way of an analogy, cite a well-known thought experiment known as Mary's Room, or knowledge argument, conjured up by the philosopher Frank Jackson. This thought experiment comes down to a two-act scenario. Act one starts with Mary, a vision scientist who has mastered all the knowledge there is to know about color. Yet she's confined to a black-white room, not known now known as Mary's room. What she knows about color is purely theoretical knowledge. Act 2 is about Mary stepping outside of the black and white room. She learns for the first time what it means to experience red. The quality feels different than what she knows theoretically. Frank Jackson, the philosopher who conceived this parable, would have felt vindicated by the fact that a variation of his thought experiment really happened in 1884. The protagonist is not a fictional character, Mary, but the real person named Kang Youwei, an erudite Chinese scholar. Here I'm using a generic period photo for illustration. Kang had read extensively about the cosmos and the world through printed books, ancient and modern. Nothing had prepared him for a rude awakening in 1884, when he purchased the telescope and the microscope for epistemological interest. He was able to experience through both lenses the real fabric of reality and texture of the world. Ants appear or loom larger, optically comparable with the elephants. Their intestines look like those of human organs. The cognitive shock rattled Kang Youwei to the core. He thought he had known everything he needed to know about the world out there. All that security of knowledge now vanished into the thin air. He now came to see the cosmos in an entirely different light. Moreover, it struck him that sentient beings inhabiting the cosmos, whether humans or insects, acquire equal status, not to mention people from different countries. Concern with suffering is the starting point of Buddhism. Buddhist texts, which Kang knew well, are shot through with the theme. Kang had read extensively about bodily pain and human suffering, both from historical and Buddhist texts. The 3rd century BCE massacre of 450,000 soldiers of the slave Zhao by the Qing army was the most memorable. However statistically mind-boggling it may have been, it registers no more than a historic fact. It was not until Kang saw realistic pictures of the dead bodies strewn on the battlefield of the 1870 Franco-Prussian War that he really felt the pain. The gory side aroused universal compassion in him. Now it is Buddhism with a vengeance. Buddhist cosmology had sowed the seed for equality of sentient beings. Modern optical device drove that concept home. The medium that deepened Kang Youwei's awakening is a magic lantern slideshow that projects realistic images on the screen. The medium was known in China as shadow play. While the technological apparatus was borrowed from the West, the medium was conceptually informed by the long-standing indigenous tradition of shadow play and the Buddhist concept of shadow cave. The shadow play that Kang Youwei attended signaled a new phase of Buddhist art. It was the vivacity and verisimilitude of the images and the optical technology, the visual technology, that enabled Kang Youwei to experience the onslaught of empathy, the pain of fellow human beings and the sentient beings suffering. From there, he was to develop his universalism in a Buddhist vein. Kang Youwei commanded a large following. In 1896, a group of his followers or like-minded individuals gathered in the Light Shadow Tower in Shanghai to take a group photo. These were all eminent thought leaders at the time: Liang Qicao, Tan Sitong, Song Su, Sun Baoxuan, and so on. The choreography was deliberate and performative, drawing on well-known iconographic conventions, that is 7 stages of the bamboo grove and the harmony of the 3 regions, and so on. 3 individuals, Liang Qicao, Sun Baoxuan, and Tan Sitong, notably present themselves as Buddhists as they display mudra. The Buddhist undertone goes deeper than bodily gestures and postures. Tan Sitong, the person on the right, with a dramatic body gesture, is most notable in his Buddhist thought and practice. His exposure to Buddhism was belated but decisive. Through Liang Qicao, the figure to the left on the front row, Tan was drawn to Buddhist imaginary. However, his encounter with Buddhism was like that of Kang Youwei, technologically mediated. Both Buddhism and electricity fascinated Tan. Buddhism distilled in him the universal sentience and compassion. Electricity offered him a window of global connectivity. Aggregating the two enabled Tan to envision a new sensorial and experiential medium of world making. In 1897, the year following the photo, the group photo, so this year may not register much in our collective radar screen. In hindsight, it was a year of significance. Stars were aligned. 3 events took place in 1897. First, Tan Sitong publishes on ether. Second, Nikola Tesla published on electricity. Third, South City Power Station opened in Shanghai. The publication by Tan and Tesla on a similar topic is a coincidence. They were certainly unaware of each other. It is not a coincidence that they similarly drew on Buddhist or Indian thought. Tesla met the Indian savant Swami Vivekananda in 1896. From him, Tesla learned about the Indian concepts of prana, the out-breath, akasha, and so on. These inspired him to envision a kinetic energy in space and conceive electricity as a wireless medium of communication that can connect disparate entities globally. The Buddhist concepts Akasha and Sanya equally fascinated Tan Sitong. The Huayan cosmology enabled him to imagine the interconnectedness and interrelatedness and the interpenetrability of everything across time and space. With the advent of electricity, individual consciousness are thus linked. Electricity, quote, unites heaven, earth, and the mirror creatures, the self and other man, into a single organism, unquote. With electricity, Tan imagined interpersonal telepathy or connectivity through what would now be called person-to-person brainwave interface. It is remarkable that both Tesla and Tan were thinking the same thought in the same year. It is just as remarkable that both were drawing on Indian thought. It was also in 1897, another historical event took place. Again, at the outset, it was a coincidence. In hindsight, the coincidence appeared less coincidental. On December 18, 1865, the first gaslight was lit in the international settlement in Shanghai. The illuminated urban area stood in sharp contrast with the area outside the international settlement, lit by oil lamps, paper lanterns, and insect wax candles. The introduction of gaslight eventually led to the reputation of Shanghai as a city of blazing light. The electric lighting was a game changer in this process. In 1880, Thomas Edison in the US filed a patent for the invention of the incandescent lamp. It essentially propelled the entire world from the gaslight era into the electric age. 2 years later, in 1882, Archibald John Little's firm in Shanghai, Little and Company, launched an electrification project in the international settlement. While most local residents marveled at the blazing light, officials in Shanghai Chinese municipality dismissed as sheer wizardry. Shanghai then amounted to a tale of two cities. At night, the luminosity of the international settlement's bund stood in sharp contrast with the darkness of the world-in Chinese city to the south, lit by oil lamps. The more sensible, educated, elite Chinese community began to overcome the conservative bigotry and pushed for electrification. Thus, in 1897, the first Chinese-owned South City power plant was built in Shiliupu Old Pier area. This city newspaper lauded the electric light generated by the plant as sun sinking into the dark abyss and moon disk hanging high. By 1911, the plant lit 2,000 incandescent lamps in the Chinese city. In 1958, at the height of Great Leap Forward, a 165-meter tall chimney was built in the expanded plant. For quite some time, the chimney held the pride of place in Shanghai's cityscape, a beacon of light epitomizing the height of industrialization. By the 1990s, however, the one-time symbol of industrial progress had become an eyesore and an elephant in the China store. Seen as a source of pollution, it fell into disuse. The power station was closed down in 2007. In 2010, Shanghai hosted a large-scale World Expo. The erstwhile South City power plant was turned into an exhibition space and named the Pavilion of Future of the city. Subsequently, it became the Power Station of Art. In 2012, the site became the key venue for the 2012 Shanghai Biennale. The event hosted 90 solo artists and institutions from 27 countries, 30 cities from Detroit to Auckland. The participants' work were to spread over 97,000 square feet of exhibition space with a 300 or so square feet facility. What would be the hook for such a behemoth affair? Two conceptual models inform the curatorial blueprint. First is the adaptive use of defunct structures. Second, the integral theory of conscious cosmos. The significance of the power plant site was not lost on the Biennale curators, chief among them, Qiu Zijie. London's Tate Modern apparently lent itself as a prototype and a source of inspiration, a reference point. It turned an obsolescent electric power plant into a contemporary art exhibition hub. Its industrial ruggedness and awe-inspiring colossus telegraph an expansive inclusivity and a new vision for global art, bidding farewell to the old-fashioned connoisseur gentility preoccupied with safeguarding the old canon. Likewise, the 2012 Shanghai Biennale fronted an electric power plant as its primary gateway and the organization or organizing principle. The curatorial drawing board put in play 4 R words: resources, revisit, reform, and republic, to organize the exhibition artworks. They also form a 4-step linear narrative. The power plant fuels the plotline. Resource is a double entendre, suggesting both natural and spiritual resources. In the latter sense, it encompasses Asian traditions of meditation, yoga, and so on. Revisit pertains to the old vestige that can be recycled and repurposed. The two combine to feed the boiler. Reform centers on the boiler that heats things up, a crucial stage of transformation. Republic, the grand finale, is a bit of stretch here. It is said to mean vibration and resonance. Again, the terms are couched in the context of electric power industry. The concept design here taps into a number of strands of intellectual resources. There's ether or yitai and electricity. Then there's this concept, élan vital, and then there's the integral theory, and finally, telematics. The Biennale concept design thus harks back to 1897, the year when Tan Sitong published his Ether. Tesla published on electricity, and South City plant opened in Shanghai. Who would have thought that the 1897 triad would reconvene a century later? The Tesla towers looms large in the, as you can see here, looms large in the 2012 Biennale's curatorial blueprint. Back in 1897, Tan Sitong envisioned electricity as a charged medium that would encompass life worlds, including brainwaves and mental energies. Individuality could thus be transcended. Mental activities, sensibilities, and ethical values could be wired and networked into a global totality. Tan Sitong was apparently a prophet. Likewise, Tesla was conceiving similar blueprints, exploring ways of transmitting messages through air and earth, linking different continents. It is remarkable that the 2012 Shanghai Biennale blueprint actually took a playbook from the late 19th century playbook. Only the 21st century version was enhanced by Steiner's integral theory and Ascot's telematics, to be explained in a minute. Élan vital was coined by French philosopher Henri Bergson in his 1907 book, Creative Evolution, in which he addressed the question of self-organization and spontaneous morphogenesis of things, in which he addressed the question of things in an increasingly complex manner. Élan vital or vital impetus is a hypothetical explanation for evolution and development of organism, which Bergson linked closely with consciousness, with the intuitive perception of experience and the flow of inner time. Drawing on Asian thoughts, especially Buddhism, the integral theory aggregates consciousness and cosmos, mind and matter. Its forerunners include A.P. Sinnett, Rudolf Steiner, and Nikola Tesla, and others. Among its most recent champions are Ken Wilber and Irving Laszlo. Sinnett, an early theosophist, draws on Buddhism to imagine the spiritual vitality of the earthly existence. Built on Indian concepts of Akasha, Laszlo sees space not as a vacuum, but as a plenum, an ethereal medium animated by universal consciousness. Meanwhile, the 2012 Shanghai Biennale foregrounded works by Rudolf Steiner, another theosophist. Steiner's presence here is curious since he's not, strictly speaking, a contemporary artist. But knowing what Steiner stands for, we get the point. By Steiner's reckoning, our civilization faced imminent self-destruction, its unrelenting abuse of the earth and natural environment. For him, redemption would come from biodynamics, a holistic integration of spiritual, ethical, and ecological approach that would fulfill a totalized vision for a future world. It explains Biennale curators' concept design. Meanwhile, Steiner habitually used his famous blackboard drawings to link and diagram disparate concepts. And this explains the format of Biennale curators' drawing board. Telematics was another conceptual charge fueling the 2012 Shanghai Biennale. The British media and artist Roy Ascott was its advocate. Ascott was a World War II radio operator. He was accordingly drawn to the electric medium that connects multiple minds globally. Ascott's conceptual design for connectivity anticipated virtual reality. At the heart of his work is the art of cybernetics, what he calls telematics, that explores ways in which individual minds dissolve into large, moist media, part human, part machine, and share a global cyberspace. Ascott's contribution to the Shanghai Biennale is the media art design. Block letters, presumably signified data, form a virtual tile of cyberspace. Rounded tables and floating chairs amount to portals. Through them, individuals access the shared cyberspace, thereby forming and then are formed by a towering virtual architecture of global consciousness. Ascott has a strong opinion on museums, which he regards as an outmoded institution of a bygone era. According to Ascott, traditional museums direct us to the, quote, surface appearance of things and their representation, unquote. The new museum, in contrast, points us to the invisible, to the generative process of chaos or complexity, the coming into being of consciousness, the ways in which form and meaning can emerge. He envisions the future of museum as a mode of a mindium, modeled upon human mind. It is intelligent, smart, that can think for itself. How can a museum acquire mind and think? To Ascott, it should be freed from the curatorial authority, relying instead largely on the device of connectivity through which a network becomes a self-organized collective mind, thinking for itself. It is notable that the chief curator produced 2 drawings, one diagram on your left and one map on the right, to organize artworks featured in the 2012 Biennale. The diagram is that of a power station loop, process-driven and with an endpoint. The map is a sprawling topography tantamount to a neural system. One is top-down industrial design, the other leans toward the ground-up organic ecosystem. Overall, energetic regeneration, resonance, self-organization were the aspiration. In many enclaves of the Biennale, these aspirations were achieved. Let's see how the blueprint was put in play in the exhibition space. For the visitor stepping into the exhibition, one sees these 4 notable artworks. Reactivation, a diagrammatic drawing by the artist curator Qiu Zhijie featuring Tesla Tower, as you can see here. Second, one will see Elan Vital by the British artist Petro Sesti in the foreground. And then one sees a Bodhisattva with 1,000 Arms by Huang Yongping, now based in France. And finally, one sees Rebecca by British artist Samon Fujiwara. Huang's Bodhisattva with 1,000 Arms carries a double stance. It pays homage to Duchamp's bottleneck. It pays homage to Duchamp's bottle rack. It also recapitulates the traditional Chinese Buddhist iconography of the 1,000-armed Bodhisattva. To the extent that it taps into the traditional spiritual resources, it is fitting that in a concept drawing, the Bodhisattva with 1,000 arms is located in the zone of resources, conceptually aligned with the Tesla Tower. Rebecca, by the British artist Samon Fujiwara, carries a double stance, or even double entendre. It is particularly fitting for today's event, as the artist was educated in Cambridge University from 2002 and 2005. Fujiwara conceived a brilliant project. Its protagonist is a British teenager named Rebecca. She had participated in the 2001 London riot. See if the video works.
Meanwhile, they're bracing for more trouble in England. 4 days of mob violence kicked off by the shooting of a 29-year-old father over the weekend. It has spiraled in numerous directions ever since.
Start over.
Meanwhile, they're bracing for more trouble in England. 4 days of mob violence across that country kicked off by the shooting of a 29-year-old father over the weekend. It has spiraled in numerous directions ever since.
All the authorities in Britain are calling this pure criminality. They are not talking about any kind of social unrest or anything like that.
And I couldn't believe the devastation. I saw some people wheeling suitcases full of clothes, bags, even jewelry down the street.
What is happening?
First of all, it's out of control kids. They communicate with each other by Twitter, by cell phones. It's consumerism, it's no punishment, and it's the ability of social media to pull them all together.
Your point about no consequences for their actions may be changing now.
Well,
when you have 16,000 police officers
Yeah.
in these cities and more coming in.
well, that's the other problem, is that the
How to exit. Oh, back to the, yeah. Okay. Oops. Okay. So instead of being put in jail, arrangement was made so that Rebecca was sent to China to receive quote unquote education. She visited factories where consumer goods were made, such as shoe factories, the things that she had looted. There she met her Chinese age peers who had to commute hours every day to work and work hard. She then visited the Terracotta Army as the first Empress Mausoleum, allegedly to get the message about the power of unification and hard work. She then agreed to have her own sculptural, presumably, sculptural replicas made. An army of her replicas debuted at the 2012 Shanghai Biennale. Rebecca's sculptural army may indeed march on, allegedly demonstrating the power of unity and resonance. However, its inherent double stance can be inferred from the categorically related artworks grouped into the same zone of republic or resonance that you can see here. This is the Rebecca's replica army staged by Sama Fujiwara. And then you would have two related artworks in the same zone. Here's a UK artist, Gillian Waring's video photograph showing a group of friends and acquaintances who were actually asked to put on a police uniform and pose for photographs that lasted for 60 minutes. The initial uniformity and solemnity gradually give way to restlessness and disintegration. Here's Pakistan artist Bani Abini's video, distance from here, which files and strings applicants at the immigration office along parallel lines. The distractedness of the lethargic crowd apparently strains the single-minded uniformity of the severe straight lines. Nevertheless, artworks talk to each other across space. Two photographic projects included in the Republic, that is the resonance zone, make good that organizing concept of resonance. One is an installation space featuring photographs taken by Zhang Hui and Dan Er. The subjects were from Yumen in northwestern China, once the robust oil-rich region, now turning into decrepitude. Oil drilling facilities were dismantled due to exhaustion of oil supply. The photographers set up a photo studio there to capture the visages of the locals who face an uncertain future. The second was a set of Sophie Caro's photo portraits of blind sitters who were led to face and quote unquote gaze at the ocean for the first time. The two sets of works were unrelated in their respective conceptions and productions. It was by dint of the curatorial sleight of hand that they were brought together. The connection, both accidental and inevitable, serendipitously created a synergy. It took an environmentally conscious young visitor to the Biennale to identify this synergy. Ran Yifeng, who had a PhD in world economics, was a college professor of international finance and trade, a self-taught web designer, author of How to Become a Thinker, and a best-selling translator of English language works. But even these hardly describe his encyclopedia interest in food display in the staggering array of his blog posts, encompassing 23 subjects ranging from politics, entrepreneurship, technology, history, medicine, film, music, etc. It is remarkable that for all of his voracious appetite for a variety of subjects, the overwhelming breadth of artworks showcased at the 2012 Shanghai Biennale came down into these two sets of photographs, respectively by Zhang Hui and Sophie Cao. One concerns inhabitants of erstwhile oil field turned desert, and the other about the blind gazer into the sea. The two sets of photographs apparently added up in Ran's mind's eye, and induced philosophical musings. Ran posted his response on his blog. These works, Ran wrote, remind him of Heidegger's sense of Gewohnheit, or dereliction, that is, quote, having been thrown into the world, abandoned and delivered up to oneself, unquote. Rand did not elaborate on why he evoked Heidegger. The two sets of photographs speak to two different senses of dereliction. However, they surge through Rand's mind like electric currents or cross currents. The contingency of the Biennale synchronized them into a productive synergy, precisely the kind that the curators were hoping for. It is just as striking that the medium that the two sets of artworks run through is the sensitive mind of a web designer with a philosophical sensibility, one who reads Heidegger deeply wired to the internet. With what electrified him, it should be noted, is actually not some technological apparatus, but two sets of deeply humane portraits of human subjects. Roy Scott was prescient. The Shanghai Biennale that he participated in turned out to deliver a mindium. In this virtual Tao, Rand is one of the ideal denizens. So back to the question I raised at the outset, what would 21st century Buddhist art look like? It would be, so what I've presented would be a notable example. Its creators include, but not limited to, Kang Youwei, Tan Sitong, Master Hong Yi, Feng Zikai, Rudolf Steiner, Roy Ascott, Qiu Zijie, Boris Groys, Janice Hoffman, Joseph Zhang, Zhang Hui, Dan Er, Sophie Cao, Ran Yifeng, and many more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Wang. I would like to invite now Professor Francesca Tarocco. You can unmute yourself and also show your video. Professor Toko is an associate professor at Ca' Foscari University of Venice. She is a professor of Buddhist and Asian studies, and she's written extensively on media and visual culture, technology, sacred spaces, and the concept of religion in East Asia. She has published many things, and she's co-editing quite a number of projects. Among them is the Oxford Encyclopedia of Buddhism, and she's now working on a book project on Buddhism and technology in modern China. So please join me in welcoming Professor Toko.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, everyone. Let me just quickly share a screen so that we have something to look at beside myself. Yes, so thank you, Eugene Noga, the Department of Asian Studies at the University of Cambridge, and Tzu-Chi for initiating such a wonderful series of lectures. Of course, we all wish we were together in the same room rather than this, whatever, Mindium or something like that, Eugene, perhaps. So to the task, this was a very rich and thoughtful lecture, and thank you for sharing your wonderful archive and for making really this genealogy of Buddhist art. I very much agree with you. And in my own remarks, I want to echo some of your main points and perhaps ask a few questions. So yes, the subject itself needs unpacking. What indeed is Buddhism today? As you note, the invention of a new Buddhist tradition for the secular age started in earnest in 19th century Europe, or even earlier, as Ursa argues in The Birth of Orientalism, and continues both in Asia and North America to this day. Asian nationalists, Russian theosophists, British colonial officer, Italian Jesuits, and many others construed Buddhism not as a religion, but as a sort of spiritual path based on rationalism and scientific thinking. And what, if anything, is Buddhist art? For when we start looking, we find even stranger concoctions than that of Buddhist art. For instance, we find Zen art. And this is in a recent study documenting the role of the famous British translator Arthur Waley in the making of the coinage Zen art. Tim Barrett, who's not here, unfortunately, today, he shrewdly notes that whether there existed or exists a Zen art as such in the Japanese world or its equivalent in China, one does not know. One, however, notices that anyone wishing to undertake a study of the links between the Chan tradition and painting in Song China and thereafter does have to take the existence of a notion of Zen art in English quite seriously, since for about a century the term has had an important degree of currency in Anglophone writing. An important new dissertation on Chan figure painting of the 13th and 14th century thus is obliged in a brief introductory section to delve back beyond Suzuki and his seminal discussion of Zen aestheticism, 1938, to discuss also Okakura Tenshin and Ernest Fenollosa. So a fuller account would, however, no doubt have to include not only these names, but also the first work to allude to the construct Zen art in its title, which is in fact Waley's Zen Buddhism and its relationship to art, which appeared in April 1922. And so it is that some of the initial interventions in the assembling of Buddhist art, even Zen art, were mediated in the Anglosphere by people who had little to no access to primary sources. Waley's knowledge of Chinese at that stage was not very good. And three, yes, the vexed question of Buddhist modernity that you mentioned. And I have, I have thought long and hard myself about that. And within Buddhism of the past 100 or so years, defining the modern would seem to require the invention of its opposite, the traditional. This dog-tired dichotomy, however, seems to hide as much as it reveals. And since the turn to religion in the 1990s, critical social theorists have debated the nature and place of religion in modernity and examined religious culture in light of what was once called the secularization thesis. Within Buddhist studies, calling on a divergent array of theoretical frameworks, scholars have sought to explain the broader implication of the study of Buddhism by aligning it with various anti-modernist, modernist, and postmodernist tendencies. Ultimately, I guess what we need is to read the cultural significance of Buddhism in modern Chinese societies in ways that transcend the tendency to identify too exclusively with one or various of several highly problematic dichotomies, including modern traditional, secular religious, religion, science, or religion technology. Myself and others, for instance, have argued against the widespread idea that the expansion of modern communication technologies would necessarily bring about the dissolution of religious authority, to show that in the digital age, electronic images and text have visibly extended their reach into the mundane core of Buddhist everyday life. Alas, as we know, Buddhist clerics have skillfully extended their mediated reach, an example ranging from televangelism, cassette sermons, the internet, blogging, and WeChat. And not unlike consumers elsewhere, Chinese and Taiwanese practitioners, among others, daily engage with a plethora of piously coded objects, wherein Buddhist charisma and aura find new ways to infuse themselves into mass-produced artifacts. And four, yes, I agree with you, and here we can look at some of the images together, on the need to mine the early 20th century archive. And I too am fascinated by the relationship between Buddhism and one of the technologies of modernity, the visual technologies of modernity, photography, of course. And so here you have some of these images, earlier, some of the earliest images, photographic images of, with the Buddhist subject, the Dowager Emperor herself, and one of the so-called father of modern Buddhism in a probably 19th century photograph, 1898 photograph. And let me see here. And this is another famous image, two famous images. The one on the right is the deathbed image of one of the masters. Eugene also talked about, Hong Yi Fa Shi, and here he is also in a famous picture with Tenzakai. So yes, around the turn of the 20th century, photography started to permeate Chinese modes of representation, offering new outlets for Buddhist visual culture. In part, I think this was due to the fact that photographs could break down the dichotomy between representation and reality, the original and the copy. Some Buddhists saw its two main characteristics, namely the direct duplication of reality and the option to produce copies, as very desirable. And Yang Wenhui here, who founded the first modern independent Buddhist press, brought back photographic equipment from his official mission abroad. He even provided, we know from his daughter's diary, some of the studios in Shanghai with their first cameras. And in fact, among the terms to designate photography used in Chinese context, we find Buddhist-inspired terms. For example, terms like 写真 or 视影 or shadow image, 隐形. These all echo Buddhist ideas and doctrines and terminology. Many Buddhists use photography to instruct their followers on the miraculous signs of predestination on the faces of very young children, tonsured when they were as young as 4. 4 years old. Even more intriguingly, monks pose for photographic portraits in the guise of Maitreya, the Buddha of the future age, where we are now, in the 21st century. And not unlike the idiosyncratic arhats, this figure, the figure of Maitreya, is portrayed in art and literature as a sort of divine fool, whose divinity is disguised by an eccentric physical appearance. All of that, of course, could be captured in the photographs. I mean, and we can go on and on, around, Buddhist representation and Buddhist images and how, aura and charisma are captured, in early photographic prints, but also today, with the digital augmentation. And 5, by way of conclusion, 2 final comments, questions. Religion, art, media all involve and mobilize epistemological and cosmological matters of the constitution of the real. People create things, the things that in turn create them. And animating a whole magnificent panoply of Buddhist things are actual people who produce objects and then render them dynamic in practice. In placing Buddhism as religion within a theory that accounts for human sociality more deeply through mediation of all kinds, we connect its present to its own past history, as you do very well yourself in your book, of sophisticated investment in objectification. Finally, when looking at the profusion of Buddhist-inspired images displayed in today's China and elsewhere, I wonder about the interimplication of aesthetics and ethics in order to take up both the materiality of Buddhist life and its moral implications for personhood in this new era of explosive urban growth in China and its diaspora. One, of course, needs to look at specific artists, including, Zhu Zhijie, as you mentioned, and to the influence their participation in Buddhist practices as an ethics of spiritual searching, at the very least, has upon the aesthetics of their work. Conversely, one could also, moving from the artistic work, from its aesthetic formal qualities, try to understand how the recent proliferation of Buddhist-inspired activity through aesthetic engagement and art making influences the spread of the Dharma and its ethical projects in modernity. Yes, these are my comments, and just perhaps by way of showing you a few more things, in terms of the archive. This is, I'm sure, something you're very familiar with. It's also a photograph, he's a lens. Onlay is a lens-based artist who sort of evokes in this performative piece, Liang Kai, who also was in Eugene's lecture. And this is one of my own personal favorite. I think you know him. This is a fantastic photographic series called The Wailing Arhats, where, you have a sort of constant re-evoking of old monasteries displaced by the building of the dam in the Three Gorges. So just showing you some images here. Okay, that's all from me.
Okay, thank you very much, Francesca. You froze in my screen for a moment. I'm not sure if it's just my connection or. Okay, but
yeah,
can you hear me well now? Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for your comments. So now it is my great pleasure to also welcome Professor Tang Hui, who is a scholar of Chinese art and also a prominent artist. So we're looking forward to your remarks, Professor Tang.
Open the microphone, turn on the microphone.
Okay. Firstly, I want to thank Professor Wang and Professor Taroko for their amazing presentation just now. I'm so grateful for the coverage and my senior Mr. He Rishen's invitation for me to share my thoughts as creator of the Buddhist art. My name is Tang Hui. I'm currently a professor and chair of the mural department in the Central Academy of Fine Arts at Beijing. For many years, I worked in the designing, creating murals and public art. I'm also an artist who works in practical contemporary art. Also, I'm designer for the Chinese soft currency renminbi. Today, I'm here to briefly discuss how artistic work inspired by the Buddhism must be closely linked with the Buddhism itself. 21 years ago, I completed the creation of a mural for the Buddhist Tzu Chi Foundation and their Jinsi Hall. The mural was called Great Enlightened One of the Universe. This piece was 25 meters tall by the 60 meters wide, which had over 2 million mosaic tiles. It was created with a futuristic experience and designed to convey the delicate beauty found in the Chinese Gongbi artwork. The image portrays a standing Buddha in the universe. And behind him are the silhouettes of other standing Buddhas inspired by Buddha images from different dynasties. This mural uses artistic expression to showcase the great imagery of the 3,000 words. At the same time, it also illustrates the idea that Buddha was born from the void. The main Buddha holds an arm ball in one hand. On the left hand, he gently touched the Pure Land and refined it, which I used the crystal clean earth. We can see the clouds on the crystal globe from the all night of the fine continent. Also, the scene used the images of the animal represent life, to represent life. Those originated from the Buddhist tales from on the cave walls in Dunhuang, China. At last, at the bottom of the mural is Bodhi leaf, which symbolizes the spreading of great love. This great enlightened one of the universe took about 10 years to design. Through the process, I created around 100 different drafts, include ones that use the oil painting, sketching, sculpting, etc. In my opinion, as an artist, the difficult in this design lie in the concept. At the beginning, when I start working on this project, I feel that it was mostly the technical challenge. I had done many research of the Buddhist visual art and visited many corners related to the Buddhist artwork. I thought that an artistic problem can be solved in the artistic way. However, I created many different designs within the 10 years. It was still a difficult task to create a satisfying result. During the 10 years, I personally experienced every aspect of life in Tzu Chi. I was especially influenced by the Master Zeng Yan's concept of the humanistic Buddhism. In these years, I living at the Jinsi Adobe and slowly used to the vegetarian diet so that I can better experience the world of Tzu Chi. Afterward, I was to portray a mural that world, conveying the spirit of Middle Buddhism. Then I found out that I was able to illustrate the design I had in my mind. Finally, after many revisions, I was able to complete it. What I want to express here today is that creating a piece of Buddhist artwork is not simple making an artwork. Within it are many elements, including Buddhist teachings, faithings, presence, affections, all are way of life. Because such creatings are for the for specific audience, they must carry special experience too. Now 21 years have passed. Currently, my kind is experiencing the heavy blow for the COVID-19 and the environmental problems that are becoming more and more important. I believe such a piece of artwork can bring us a message. In the universe, life on Earth is so precious. How we can protect it is questions that this piece of art is training to tell. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Tang, for joining us. This has been wonderful. Thank you very much. I'm going to change now to a gallery view so that all our panelists can view each other. And I'd like to open now. We have some time for questions. We have already one question in the question and answers box, and which is directed to Professor Wang. Eugene, can you see the question below?
Yes, I can see. Yes. Should I answer now?
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Well, good to see you, Adam. I still remember you back in Harvard, so I hope you're doing well there. Yeah, I'm sure you do well in England. This is a kind of complex question you ask. Basically, you're asking whether I can speak on the birth of modern art as an outcome of the West encounter with Buddhism. Well, the reason I say it's complex and difficult to answer is that in the art history field, the main narrative as we know it about the rise of modern art doesn't quite feature the encounter of Buddhism. At least that's the sort of mainstream narrative. So you come from the China study field, so I guess you would have a different notion of what constitutes the narrative for rise of modern art. I would just say that, okay, if we go that route, then I would say it's not so much the mainstream artwork, but some of the key players. I can think of, for instance, Charles Freer as who initiated the Freer Gallery, and eventually has now become the National Gallery of Art, Asian Art. And so his encounter with Buddhist aesthetics and Buddhism is, and of course, a whole generation that he represents is very interesting. So when he went to Longmen, for instance, he was so struck by the colossal Longmen Buddha that he felt like there's nothing like it ever in his experience of art, and nothing really surpassed the beauty and the grandeur and the wonder of that Longmen. Longmen Buddha. So actually, I did a presentation on that subject some time ago in Korea, and the key argument I was going to make is that is a key question I was going to ask: why was Charles Freer so taken by the Longmen Buddha? And my initial research shows that America was at the stage where they felt like somehow the West, there's a decline, there's a spiritual crisis following the Darwinism, and there's a vacuum to be filled. And then for some of the sensitive elite in the West and in America, they kind of look to the East to filled with that spiritual vacuum in the wake of the Darwinism. And then they found that there's somehow the Buddhist ascetic offer a kind of universalism, and also it will help them to conceive a kind of subjectivity that transcends national boundaries and cultural traditions. And also there was that particular dynamic of America at the moment position itself as the unifying force connecting East and West, and position it as the main player in the world. So all these add up to produce this kind of sensibility where one can speak of some kind of female subjectivity. They actually see more Buddhism as more of a, especially embodied by the Longmen Buddha, a certain kind of feminized subjectivity that stands for universal sensibility. So it's a complicated story, but Charles Freire actually is, I think, quite revealing in the kind of response he had of the Buddhism, Buddhist art, Buddhist aesthetics, and then how he kind of went on to embrace Buddhist art. So this is just one. I mean, Francesca already kind of spelled out these other aspects in her comment, which I really appreciate. And so I guess this couldn't be quite a story of how the rise of modern art in relation to the encounter of Buddhism. It's more like what kind of aesthetic sensibility came into being in the West in the encounter with Buddhism. The mainstream art historical narrative hasn't quite accepted that the rise of Buddhism, encounter with Buddhism, played a key role in the rise of modern art. Maybe that narrative need to be challenged, and so what we're doing is to maybe put the encounter with the Buddhism in the picture of that larger narrative of the rise of modern art. That's a thought I have at this moment. But good to reconnect with you, Adam.
Adam has actually already posted a follow-up in the Q&A. Can you see it below?
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's what. Yeah. I see where you go. So that's why I was trying to push my talk and also my recent study in that direction, which is that if we think about it's not so much modern art, it's actually to what extent the Buddhist art and Buddhism is relevant to our 21st century sensibility. And I do feel that this is a good timing, a good moment, because if you think about if there's anything that really is commonly interests us, consciousness is one of the key issue. What it feels like to be to be us, and what is experience, and so all these become issues with the the advancement of technology, and we experience the world differently. So we start to really ask more about what is it to be human, what is it to be us, and what is to what extent can we understand consciousness, especially when in the post-human era, all kinds of devices make it possible to have automation, robots, and all that. So these highlights and accentuate the pressing issue of what constitutes consciousness. And to that extent, the Buddhist resource really provide a lot of answers to the question, or at least Buddhist resource text and images have pushed us to think about this, what is conscious, what is, and so on. So what I do often is to really excavate that kind of resource embedded in Buddhist art in Dunhuang and elsewhere, where some of these cave paintings actually really is a fine art of staging consciousness and staging mental theater. So this is sort of thing that one does not quite get when you visit these caves and listening to the tour guide giving you a rundown of the narrative content of these murals. What is missed often is that, in fact, behind this narrative, it's not the illustration of Buddhist sutras, but actually it's more of a visual staging of how the mind works, how the consciousness works, how one can, how essentially the consciousness amounts to some kind of theater, and that theater is multi-acts in structure that has a process that transcends time and space. So to that extent, I think that's where I see the relevance of Buddhism for our 21st century sensibility, and this is the sort of issue that I'm interested in, and also this sort of thing that I think we have here Francesca, who has been doing really remarkable work on people like Feng Zikai, for instance, and Francesca is really the world authority on the the remarkable work Feng Zikai produced, the Hu Sheng Hua Ji, and the key issue there is really the sensation, what it means to have in other words, what Feng Zikai does is really to stage through the pictorial means a kind of sentience, compassion, and how the whole universe, regardless of man or animals, and we can all share some wavelengths of sensibility, and so that's another kind of rich resource that I think is quite relevant to our current sensibility, 21st sensibility, our care for the animal rights, our care for the environment, and so on and so forth. So these are the things that I think make Buddhism and Buddhist art, or the kind of Buddhist art, especially that in the 20th century represented by Feng Zikai and others, that really bring us up to date to what we should all commonly care for. Thank you, Adam.
So we have a follow-up question from Adam for all of you, as well as 2 other questions in the Q&A box. I will leave the floor to you to choose which ones you would prefer answering first.
The Dunhuang question I've asked.
Mm-hmm.
What else?
Adam is asking if you can all comment on the formal or conceptual link between Professor Tang's wonderful mural and the tableau vivant of Empress Cixi.
Oh,
It's a challenging one, Adam.
Yeah, very good question. These are really, see, that's an interesting question, because it's really context specific, I guess. If I were to speak to the circle of art historians, they probably wouldn't quite link them together. But for the since we're largely in a crowd with not art historians, so I guess to see this kind of question would not be surprising. The key issue, I think, is the medium. If they were to be related, it's not the kind of, is it the photographic medium on the one hand, and then the mural painting on the other, which by extension is some kind of public art. So we are therefore talking about when we think about how do we make Buddhist art relevant to the 21st century, the key question therefore is what kind of medium should we settle for or focus on? And I feel Professor Tang, I always admire Professor Tang. I know him as well for a long time, and he has always produced wonderful, wonderful public artworks and also some of the installation. One of the most amazing installation that I first saw was actually in Shanghai in a Biennale, and he staged this utopian moment where he showed a public square, and then he showed through his really superb drawing some of these sculptural figures through drawing, actually posing as, you know, in a sort of quasi-Soviet style, but you could see that, you know, it's some kind of rip on this the grandeur of the public art, but also make it that so personable and relatable instead of staying on the pedestal. So I was so struck by the beauty and the conceptual richness of his visual staging of the grand monuments that you see in the socialist countries. And so I immediately tried to reach out to him, and then we met in Beijing and we became friends. So I guess back to the question, that the public art has so many different ways of staging, and Professor Tang certainly is one master in that regard. But there are also competing modes. If we think about the public arts that really impact our 20th and 21st century, well, speaking first 20th century, for instance, you would think like, okay, if you go to Washington, D.C., the most telling and impactful public art would be Maya Ling's Vietnam Memorial. And that takes a different kind of form. But it certainly is powerful, or more powerful than the Martin Luther monument, which also was created by a Chinese artist, and he just resorted to some of the, I guess, more conventional way of staging Martin Luther King and showing the towering figure. And that hasn't quite impacted the public in a way that Maya Ling's Vietnam Memorial has. So this is something to think about. And another thing, I think the overall, I think the artists have been pushing for different ways of staging public art in regard of to charge them with some kind of Buddhist theme. I think some of the successful examples all over the world, and one of the trends and tendencies actually to try to deploy kind of earthy environmental medium, a natural medium, to show how we are, the natural medium itself constitute a way of communication. And so overall tendency is to move away from some kind of iconic tradition. But this is not to say the irrelevance of iconic tradition. So Professor Tang's work still, I think, has that classic beauty and emotional undertone that is still relevant to us today in the 21st century. And so, yeah, it's just in the end, I think we need just to think about in what kind of material medium Buddhist art need to take. And I think, you know, the more variety of competing modes, the better, I think. So, well, then going back to the earlier moments, the Cixi photograph, that's a different kind of ballgame. But there is but that moment is actually quite interesting. And that's why today's lecture, I chose electricity as the medium, because that was a moment fascinating in all rounds, because the encounter with the electric medium, with optical medium, was so new and challenging and shocking to the Chinese at that time. It actually therefore created a certain kind of experience that now we take for granted, but back then was actually quite refreshing and interesting and conceptually even provocative. So that's why I remain fascinated by that moment when the Chinese encountered Western technology. And in that encounter, there's a lot of new modes of consciousness, new modes of sensibility, as demonstrated by Kang Youwei, Tan Sitong, and so on. I mean, these are the really towering figures in the history of Chinese culture. But what is interesting is also the sense of loss or disorientation someone like Kang Youwei experienced. He attributed the impact of Western technology to realism, which is somewhat misguided. So that led to some, yeah, so in any case, it's not about realism. It is really about a kind of new media and technology that produce new experience. So he was lost, therefore while he advocated for realism, a realist painting, he actually settled in his own pursuit in the medium of calligraphy and steely carving and so on. And because only in calligraphy he felt he could express or set forth his aspiration for what is good for China and so on. So you could see that there was a split in his advocacy. On the one hand, he advocated for realistic painting, but in his own practice, he settled for calligraphy, presumably because he couldn't paint. But in any case, just a long short to say that the advent of photographic technology and media technology opened really a whole range of possibility for Chinese at the time in ways that that period still deserve more careful study. And myself is interested, and Francesca has also done wonderful work in that regard. So, but they are really to be set aside on a different kind of context, and it's hard to put them in the same kind of mental cabin or mental box. They don't quite hand together. In other words, the Cixi photograph and the Professor Tang's painting, I mean, there are two different kind of categories of things, and it would be hard to think, even hold these two in the same thought. Somehow I find that very hard. So at the end of the day, the key message is we need to always historical context, and each time period really has different kind of concerns. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. And what better place to have this discussion than in cyberspace, right? With us scattered across the globe. Since we only have a few more minutes left, I also want to invite Professor Tooku and Professor Tang to share any ideas, remarks, questions, thoughts you might like to share before we end the session.
Yes, yeah, thank you. I mean, again, Eugene, these were wonderful comments, and really, I wonder, that if in fact we have to really sort of try and conceptualize the electronic image as something that is, in some ways, art historically, perhaps peculiarly Chinese or peculiarly Buddhist. I mean, in some ways, I mean, I've been trying to think about that myself, but I'm really impressed that that you put together this incredible assemblage of images and the theory that is there as well. And yeah, Itai clearly, absolutely. I mean, Tan Setong is so important and so today as well, right? So yeah, absolutely. The circulation of images and electric and electronic images, I don't know what we call them, but something like that. But yeah, thank you. That was really precious. Thank you.
Okay, Professor Tang Hui will speak in Mandarin, and I'm going to translate for him. And Tang Hui 教授，你可以讲一下，你整个的感受。那也有观众问你，就是对于这个宇宙大觉者你的看法，还有它所呈现的意涵，你可以用最后的几分钟来做评论一下，也对于汪教授的演讲的评论。你没有开麦克风。
谢谢何日森translating my words in the speeching。我的英语不太好，然后这个我只能让何先生给我翻译了。我跟汪教授是很早的朋友。然后我觉得汪教授他这个非常敏锐，在这个上海双年展上能够看到我的作品，能够欣赏我的作品，我特别的开心这个事情。
I have a long friendship with the Professor Wang, and he feel great honor when Professor Wang visited the exhibition in Shanghai to look at his creation, and he feels so honored and grateful for that.
确实，汪教授的这个非常精彩的讲演里面谈到这个当代艺术，而我所创作的是叫 public art， 对，它是我觉得这两个东西呢，确实我的这个 public art 是21年前的作品。
Yeah, I think that Professor Wang portrayed the ideal of the Buddhist art. And what I'm doing now is a public art. This is two different dimensions. And the creation of the Enlightened One has been done 21 years ago. So it's a long time.
对，汪教授谈到邱志杰、庄辉，这些都是我的朋友，他们都从事当代艺术的创作。宇宙大觉者
Wang Zhijie, the other guy, they're all my good friends, and we've been associated with each other for a long time.
我今天谈到的主题就是说，我创作这个宇宙大觉者的时候，我觉得这个佛教的信仰在这个作品里面起到很大的作用。
When I thinking to create the image of the Enlightened One, indeed, the Buddhist concept and the doctrine has deeply influenced and embedded in it.
所以这个21年前的作品呢，对我来说就是是一次非常特殊的经历，因为这件作品我也谈到，它是面对的是特殊的人群。
And this creation I made 21 years ago. It's quite a special experience because I made it for a specific audiences.
就像当年的米开朗基罗在创作西斯廷壁画的时候，他的心境是一样的。
Just like Michelangelo make the painting in the Justine Chapel for the Catholic Church, the same experiences that he has been underwent.
我要说的就这些。
That's what I share. Thank you so much.